Hi there, welcome to my new filmmaking shed, or as I like to call it, my shed of nightmares. I haven't actually set it up yet. It doesn't have power as such, but as soon as it does, I'm going to be moving in here, and this is where I'm going to be doing all of the editing and monster building from now on. Here and there. PC's there. So today I'm going to take you through the process of building the props from my previous video, Try and Cat Me from Other Dimensions. So if you haven't seen the original video, then this is going to make no sense to you whatsoever. So go ahead and click the link on the screen now, go watch that, and then come back. Oh wait, it's okay. I'm bored of waiting, let's continue. So there's a lot to get through in this video because the original video actually took about 2.5 months from start to finish to do. And that was mainly because I made like 20 plus props. It may not look like it, but it was actually one of my most ambitious videos I've ever made because of the sheer volume of props. So let's start. But before we begin on the method, we're gonna need a materials list. We're gonna need a materials... I don't know why I'm surprised, it happens every time. I don't know why I expected any different, because it's just every time. This is a box of his possessions. What's this?
Hello! I am Materials List.
Where's that voice coming from?
This is the last will and testament of Materials List. If you are reading this, I am dead now. I wanted to leave everything to you. All of my materials.
Oh, great.
But not my fluffy thing! You cannot have that. You can have my collection of one bit of felt.
Yeah, that's great, really.
Pieces of not chocolate, but some wood, I think.
Yes, it's some wood.
And the keys to my sports car.
Ooh.
The sports car is also in the box.
Oh.
It's a small materials car.
Don't know what I expected, really.
But most importantly, I left you this reading out of the materials list.
How is he doing this?
You will need monster clay, kitchen foil, scrap plasticine, acrylic paints, clay nail varnish, eyes of a doll, hot glue gun, cotton wool, lovely liquid latex, and liquid latex thickener. Oh, kissy kissy. It's in my last will and testament, kissy kissy. Both of them. And some other surprise things that I don't want to say about, because I'm running out of space on this page. People will figure it out, they're watching the video. Okay, I go now.
Great. So now for the method.
Hi.
Oh yeah, do you have anything else to add, overly cautious Kevin?
I just wanted to say the chemicals in this process can give off toxic fumes, so take care when using them, wear a face mask, and use them in a well-ventilated area.
Thank you.
And be careful of the tools, like the knife and the hot air gun. They're also quite dangerous, and melting cling film can be dangerous too.
Very wise.
That goes for everyone watching the video too.
Very good.
I wouldn't say I'm overly cautious.
No, I guess you're not really, not overly.
Can I be called sensible, Kevin?
Okay, that's fine with me, yeah.
Or handsome, Kevin? Sexy, Kevin.
So on with the method. So, let's begin with the Lego. So first, I made the monster, and I began by marking and cutting 2 shapes out of card to form the basic head shape for the mask. So I used more pieces of card and a hot glue gun to form the mask shape around this cast of my face. He's seen some stuff. So I continued to build the shape of the mask up with some scrunched up paper and masking tape. Then I papier-mâché'd, apparently, over the top of the mask with watered down PVA glue and kitchen roll. Strips of kitchen roll. Once this had dried, I painted over with a base coat of cream-coloured acrylic paint. So once that had dried, I did a coat of watered down brown acrylic paint, and then I dabbed off the excess paint with kitchen roll from the high points. To just leave the paint in the low bits and the dimples. So I finished off the paint job on the mask by airbrushing in some details, say around the eye sockets and the cheekbones, with some brown acrylic paint that I'd watered down with some airbrush paint thinner. Then once dry, I sealed the mask with satin sealer spray. And then I went to get some sticks. I punched holes in the back of the mask to thread the sticks through, and then from the other side, I wound them together with some wire to hold them in place. And then finally, I glued some circles of black, semi-transparent material around the eye sockets to finish up. So the mask was a bit of a rust job as I only needed to wear it for 5 minutes. As a result, it wasn't very comfortable. I had sticks burying in my skull for the filming, but looked alright. Next, for the root ball, I cut a large number of lengths of armature wire and wound these together in pairs. I then fused all the pairs together with some melted polymorph plastic, and then this also acted as a rigid base. So I started trying to cover the armature wire with strands of wool that I dipped in liquid latex, but this wasn't really working, it wasn't giving the look I wanted and it wasn't covering the wire. So I switched to this brown fur stuff that I also dipped in liquid latex and coated the wire in. And then once this had dried, I found a load more thinner twigs, covered these in latex and attached them to the back of the root ball. And then once those had dried, I painted them brown. And then this is the root ball finished, and I just left it to dry. So, for the gobstopper, I took some warmed up polymorph plastic and rolled this into a sphere. And then once the sphere was nearly hardened, I scratched the rune shape into the surface. And then once it was completely cooled and hardened, I gave it a spray coat of acrylic paint in a bone color. I painted the inside of the rune with some red paint. And then once that was dry, I gave the inside of the rune a paint with some red oil wash paint. And then I gave the rest of the gobstopper a coat of some brown oil wash paint. I mixed some 2-part epoxy resin and then added in some red paint and then dabbed this in the recess of the rune shape. And this dries slightly transparent to look a bit like wet blood. I then took a silicone spherical ice cube maker and some of my garden, or earth, shavings. I mixed water with PVA glue and then I mixed the soil with this. I added the soil to the silicone mold with the gobstopper in the middle and pressed the mold closed. And the PVA glue just holds the soil together. So I didn't release the mold till the morning of filming and I only got one take of crumbling the soil away from the gobstopper because I only made one. Next is the Cronenberg tube. So to start the mask, I took my head cast and built up the general shape of it using warmed up monster clay. And then of course gave it a coat of thickened liquid latex. Once that had dried, I used a mix of latex and flour to create a paste and slapped this on to create the meaty Cronenberg texture. Next, I painted the mask using watered down red acrylic paint, and I dabbed off all the excess red paint from the high points. And once the paint had dried, I coated it in lovely liquid latex. Then, I took a hot air gun and some cling film and melted several layers of the cling film onto the top of the mask. When you melt the cling film like this, it twists and shifts and looks like little tendrils of slime. So that's the Cronenberg mask done. Next, I sculpted schlabo. So first, I created his basic body shape with scrap plasticine. I wrapped this in kitchen foil and then coated this with warmed up monster clay. So next, I built up more details around his eyes and mouth with more monster clay, and then I built his little leggy feet hands. Then, I coated him in a layer of thickened liquid latex. I waited for that to dry, and then added another. On top of this, I added some more flour and latex paste to create his delicious meaty lumps. Once that had dried, I removed the latex from the sculpt, cut some eye holes, and then added some latex to the cut edges on the eye holes to soften the cut. I painted some little mini doll's eyes with red acrylic paint, nail varnished them, and then glued them into the schlabo. I then stuffed his leggies with some cotton wool and added in some twisted up armature wire to form the shape of his leg, and then sealed it up with some glue and liquid latex. I did this with all the legs and then added in a central ring of armature wire to fix all the legs to. And once this was dry, I painted the schlabo. I started with the red of his mouth and then did a red wash over the rest of his body and then covered this in a coat of liquid latex. So once that was all dry, I did some extra touch-up of paint around the leg folds and then airbrushed his lips. Finally, I sprayed the little fellow with some satin sealer spray. The schlabo lolly, or poo stick, I made out of polymorph plastic that I shaped around a lollipop stick. And then once cool, I coated this with plastic primer spray and then airbrushed the brown color on top. And then once that had dried, I gave it a wash with some brown paint oil and then sprayed it with satin sealer spray. So now for the orb. So first I needed to buy a 3D printer. So, a few bolts tightened up and cables plugged in later, we have a 3D printer. And and I'm ready for my first print. So, the 3D printer was working, and at this point I now had to teach myself Blender and the 3D printing software. Step 1 was to model this in Blender. So it was essentially a decorated plastic pot with some supports underneath to hold up the suspended underside of the pot. So I then export it from Blender into the 3D printing software, which takes the model and slices it all up and tells the printer how it wants it to print it in layers. So the first print was a bit of a fail. And here's Past Will to explain. The internal supports came loose and were moving around. They came unstuck from the printing bed. Thanks, Past Will. You really know how to explain things in the past. So I reprinted the model with a bullseye shape underneath, which held in all the vertical supports and stopped them moving about on the print bed. And this time it worked perfectly. So then I just needed to do some tidying up of the print, like cutting off any excess plastic and filing down any irregularities. Then once I was happy with how the print was looking, I sprayed it with some acrylic primer, and then once that was dry, I sprayed it with some gunmetal acrylic spray. And then the final touch was to wash the base with a black paint oil. Now for the main event. I'm going to tell you how I built the grumbo, which was by far the hardest prop in this whole video. So first things first, I modelled his cute little face in Blender. And then I set it to print. So once the printing had finished, I noticed the layers on his face were a bit too pronounced, and since the camera is going to be quite close in, you'd probably see these, so I filed them down with some fine sandpaper and a small file. So now I had his face, I sculpted the body around it. So I took some warmed up monster clay and sculpted Grumbo that beautiful body. So, now Grumbo had his handsome bod, I needed to cast a mould of it out of plaster. I began by making a container for the mould out of foam board, and I made sure this was a few inches larger than the sculpt all the way around. Then I cut some sides and glued these to the base with a hot glue gun. Since I was going to be putting some quite wet plaster into this mould, I sprayed the inside with some primer spray to give it another waterproof barrier to stop it from going soggy and collapsing. So the plan was to make a two-part mould, one half having the front of the Grumbo and one half having the back. So I needed to build up on Grumbo to the halfway point of the mould with something soft that I could remove once the first half of the plaster mold had dried. So I began building up with plasticine and then finished off the top layer of wet clay as I could get a much cleaner edge around the side of the sculpt because wet clay is much more workable. Once I had finished applying the wet clay, I pressed a few sphere shapes into it to create negatives so the two sides of the mold would line up easier. Next, for the plaster. So I used Herculite No. 2 plaster as it's harder than regular plaster of Paris and it's better for fine detail molding. So I mixed the plaster by hand to sift out any lumps. I applied a wet detail coat on first to get in all the ridges and holes, and then once the plaster mix began to dry and harden, I added on some thicker layers with a layer of hessian in the middle to give the mold some added strength. Once the plaster had dried, I removed the foam board, the plasticine and the wet clay. And then I cleaned the excess wet clay off the sculpt. When I was ready to start on the next half of the mold, I first brushed the dry plaster with petroleum jelly to act as a release agent so the two halves of the mold wouldn't fuse together. Next, I quickly used some recycled wet clay to create some lever points to wedge a screwdriver in later when the two halves of the mold are set, to prise them apart. And I also created these overflow areas where the excess silicone has somewhere to go when I close the two halves of the mold together. Then I was ready to cast the plaster again, starting with a detail layer, thicker layers, hessian, and then once finished, I used a wet hand to smooth off the top of the mold to clean it up a bit. So once it was dry, I could then get my screwdriver into those lever points to force the two halves of the molds apart. And then once I had the two halves apart, I had to clean out all the monster clay from the molds. So once the mold was clean, I then sprayed it with some mold release, which will help get the silicone cast out of the mold later. I then built a very basic stop motion armature out of double wound armature wire, which I would then set into the silicone rubber later. Talking of which, There it was. This is the first time I've ever used silicone rubber and I was really nervous as it can go wrong quite easily and it's quite expensive if it does. So this particular silicone rubber comes in 2 parts and you have to add the hardening agent to the rubber in a 1 to 10 mix and then stir thoroughly until it's all combined. So then once it was mixed in together, I added some blue acrylic paint because apparently it's not very easy to paint on silicone rubber because nothing really sticks to it, so it's easier to color it from the inside. So once mixed up, I poured the silicone rubber into both halves of the mold, popped the little armature inside, and then closed the mold up, making sure it was tightly held together with a ratchet strap. And then I left it for 48 hours to cure before I opened it up. So once I managed to prise the mold apart, which wasn't easy, and I was panicking at one point that I was going to have to smash the mold open to get Grumbo out, I could see that I hadn't mixed the silicone overly well on the back, but it didn't really matter because his back wasn't going to be on camera. But here's our lovely Grumbo boy. So next I started trimming the excess rubber from the seam line, but I realized at this point maybe my mold wasn't great because the seam line was quite thick and there was quite a lot of air bubbles. So therefore once the excess was cut off, there was quite a noticeable seam around the outside of Grumbo. So I mixed up some more blue silicone, color matching it to his body, and painted it around the seam. Because apparently the only thing that does stick to silicone is more silicone. Now back to his glorious face. So first I sprayed his face with some primer to help the paint stick to the plastic, but also hopefully smoothing out some of the layers on his face that I might not have got with the sanding. So I started painting with a brush and then realized it looked horrible, so I cracked the old airbrush out. And then I finished off some of the finer details on his face with the brush, like inside his mouth and the teeth. So once painted, I sprayed his face with satin sealer spray, and then painted and varnished his eyes, and then glued him in the spot that I'd left them in his face, in the eye holes. I then slotted his face into the silicone body. I didn't glue it in because I don't actually think the glue would stick to the silicone, and also I'd need it for the next Grumbo body I'm about to make, or was about to make, in the past. So I used the same mold and the same process to cast another Grumbo body out of silicone rubber. So then once removed from the mold, I cut a large slit down the middle of the body, almost splitting him in half. Then I coated his insides with cotton wool that I dipped in liquid latex and red paint mixed together and left it to dry. So finally, I started on the Grumbo base, which was made out of a few different sections that I modelled separately in Blender. So I modelled 4 sides, one with a hole in the middle of it for the button, and a separate panel that would sit on the front with the text on it. So I printed all these out, and then once printed, I cleaned them all up with a knife and a file. And then once they were looking all good and nice, I glued them all together. And then I cut a square foam board base and glued that onto to give it a bit of rigidity. And I went back to Blender and modelled the lid for the base, as well as the closed and open trapdoor. And then went and printed all of those. I cleaned it all up, and then glued the lid to the rest of the base. Then I sprayed all the plastic with primer, the base with this awesome lime green colour, and then the trapdoors with the gunmetal silver again. And I painted the letters on the front panel in silver with a fine detail brush. At this point, I was ready to make the transparent case. So I ordered some sheets of clear acrylic, which I then cut down to size. I did this by clamping down the acrylic and scoring both sides with a sharp knife, and then clamping the opposite end and putting pressure down on the plastic until it snapped. And then I just cleaned down the edge with a file. And then finally, I modelled and printed a capping piece for the top of the acrylic base, tied it up, and then painted it. I then glued the acrylic pieces together with super glue and then sat them on the base with the capping piece on the top. So finally, to hold Grumbo upright, I skewered him with some strong wire, drilled a hole in the back of the case, threaded the wire through, and then folded it underneath the base to give him some support. I actually hadn't anticipated how heavy a solid silicone Grumbo body would be, and his spindly little legs just wouldn't hold him upright. And then when I was animating the stop motion of him, I just switched the original body of Grumbo with the split in half Grumbo at the right frame. And there we have it. So that is finally everything finished. So that is how I made all of it. So thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and consider subscribing and the bell. So now I just want to say a quick thank you to my newest patrons, and to help me with that is my new friend, Patreon Paul.
Hello there, my name is Patreon Paul, and I'm here to thank your lovely patrons. And your names are Janos, Jacob Howarth, Pusatakan, Cole Duggan, Pixel Smasher 21, Tony Rocher, Cadet Sparkle Wolf, Garlic Man, Weston McGee, Jade Ramsey, Marazuki, Knight, Abisby, Minnie June Dance, Jasmine Bacon, Ultrasound 700, Gremlin, JCGWE, and Tyson Godsey. So thank you so much to your generous patronage. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't even exist. I've been made for the sole purpose of thanking you, out of all bits of gristle and earlobes. Okay, goodbye, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Paul will be thanking patrons from now on my channel, in fact. So if you want to be thanked by Paul, then become a patron, I guess. But yes, the help from patrons really does mean a lot, and it does help me to make these more ambitious and crazy creatures come to life. The more patrons I have, the more meat I can make, I guess. Anyway, thank you for watching. Okay, thank you, bye.